So what I'm talking about today is well, I'm thinking about ethics. There are so many things to talk to a group like this about. But when I think about ethics, I'm thinking about what I've decided to call the ethical sciences. And the ethical sciences might be easily characterized as the action sciences as well, because I think what we're doing here, and I've said this to many of you in many fora already, I think we're doing something different here in conflict resolution. I think we ought to recognize what that is. And I'm very interested to try to make sure that we keep our eyes focused on what it is that is distinctive about a social science of the kind that Kevin Avery opened with. That is one which takes normative principles and places them at the root of what they do. And there's a particular tension in that kind of enterprise, which is an intellectual. We're at a university after all, and yet we want to change the world in some ways to make it better, intervene in violent conflict in ways that make it better. And I want to speak about the tensions in that kind of a system that and in concrete ways about how one might organize our activities in more productive ways. I think we're doing most of what I'm going to be describing here today already. But what I'm going to present to you today is a set of pictures and a set of Greek words which might help you to categorize some of the things that you already do. Many of you have seen much of this before, so I apologize for repeating. I want to begin with an old idea, Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy. So this is just something I'm sure you remember from your school days. This is the old form of it that begins with knowledge and moves all the way up through evaluation. What is it? What is this thing? This is a scholar of Bloom. This is Kratval, who says the taxonomy of educational objectives is a framework for classifying statements of what we expect or intend students to learn as a result of instruction. That is, this is what we're doing. And when we have professors, you graduate students, when you teach others, you hope that something comes out of it. You hope they learn something. And what is that thing? And we describe what that thing might be. And what Bloom's taxonomy was an attempt to do in the mid-50s, coming out of the University of Chicago, was an attempt to classify some of those things. And it did it, relatively well, and also, as anything, it falls apart in certain places. This is a modification of the Bloom taxonomy, which puts our emphasis on creativity and poesis at the pinnacle, moving from very simple tasks like remembering all the way through under analyzing to creating. Now, what's interesting about this is it hasn't died. You may have imagined that you learned this and it passed away, but it did not. In fact, it's still quite alive and with us. And it's alive in kind of interesting ways here at George Mason University. So we're in conflict resolution doing this, but many others are doing it as well, and they're innovating. Now, here's a way of playing with Bloom's taxonomy. So here's the Mason Quality Enhancement Project, which was something undertaken a bit ago, still going on. I'm involved in this myself. And have benefited from seeing people who try to organize curricula and reimagine what they do, especially around these tensions between theory and practice. And as I said before, we are ahead of the curve on this, but people are catching up. And in fact, the whole university is organized now around the concept of research of consequence, which was always what we wanted to do. The question is, how can you be ethically consequential? So here's the way that they've collapsed some of these ideas. They've collapsed those first two, the top two headings into creativity. They've then classified the next two into inquiry, which is about asking questions. Could be thought of its own peak level activity, but at least here it's been placed as inquiry. And at the base is what you might call discovery. Now, this is just a way of organizing the things you might do. You begin at the base, discovery, introducing people to the various things that constitute your field. And then you move up into pathways or modes of inquiry, let's say. How do you start to ask questions that might produce answers? And then finally, you become a creative individual who has what we might call situated and contextual knowledge, not just the rules, not just even strategies as you might have in modes of inquiry, but you actually become able to decode context and apply these things creatively. That's what we're trying to do, right? So we all want to move from basic recipes into strategies and into situated contextual knowledge. This is one way of characterizing this. We're trying to implement this all around the university. A little bit challenging to do in some areas, easier in others. I won't get into this quote, but here's just a quote from Dewey it's about learning and doing. And he found from the lab school back in Chicago. Chicago is a really important place for a lot of these ideas. It turns out a number of us have had contact with the University of Chicago. And Dewey is learning and doing and experiential knowledge, of course, all of what we're about. this is a way of thinking about experiential knowledge, moving from the rule-based recipes to a situated context. Important for this has been Hannah Arendt. Sarah Cobb has been instrumental in proposing that we focus on praxis as what we're doing, that what we do is praxis, and Hannah Arendt is probably the most important character in promoting that particular way of thinking. And she also moved us back toward a Greek conception in Aristotle, which is, I think, also essential to, well, it's an ironic thing to say, which is crucial to thinking about how we ought to be moving forward in producing ethical normative sciences like conflict resolution. And this is, and by the way, note the date, 1958. So these are older ideas, but they've had their impact. So what is it that she highlights? Well, one of the things that you see is that you've got a separation between traditional scholarship, which was about producing theory or theoria, and it was around the virtue of episteme. So all know studying epistemology. The idea was to develop the disposition or the habit of theorizing. Well, on the other side was doing stuff, which was, this is the physics versus engineering divide. And when I present this work, in fact, you and I were just at a conference where this came up in Arizona, where there was a discussion, oh, well, it sounds like what you're talking about is just like, well, some people do physics, some do engineering, and so on, and there's this natural affinity. Well, that would be true in the physical sciences, because, well, unless you're really radical about these things, the laws of nature don't change just because we imagine them differently. That is, electrons don't change by becoming consciousness of there not being a proton, okay? Whereas we do, okay? It's because if you realize you're not really part of the margin, but you could be part of the center, that changes who you are and how you might live, and we all recognize that and have been speaking about it. So this classical division, where there's very little overlap between the physicist and the engineer, is the older idea, and this near complete separation is something we've been trying to get past. Now, I think in a way, now this is a book from 1974, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Some of you may have encountered this. But what I think is produced in us is an attempt to say, we've really got to jump on the other side of the teeter-totter. We've got to go over into this vita activa that Arendt talked about. We got to do practice. We got to be practitioners. Almost produces an anti-intellectualism, as you've noticed in some quarters. And I think that what it's done for us, and the way that I think I hear a lot of us talking about these issues, is what I'd call a complete synthesis of the contemplative life that Aristotle valorized and that produced natural science orientations, that produced the scientific revolution in many ways, and this active life. So that you're doing discovery, inquiry, and creativity all at once. We do it all at once. I'm just, I'm the reflective practitioner, right? I do it all at the same time. I'm doing science while I'm practicing because I'm testing hypotheses, as Wallace used to say, and I'm also doing practice when I'm a scientist, and so on. Yeah, that's true. There's a lot of feedback, and there's a lot that you can learn that way, but there's a reason why these activities were separated, and going too far over can be a challenge. I won't read the quote, but sometimes when I give this I do. It's this idea that these things, there is a Zen. To get into that moment of Zen, that's what we all try to do. The problem is, if you've ever done any of this kind of practice, especially spiritually practice, hard to stick there, right? And it's very easy to separate these things out and try to learn from them. Here's an example of real-world complications. You remember the Coney 2012 thing, where there's this activity to get after this dictator Coney. Well, there's on the one side we produce things. This is the Oxford Journal of African Affairs. On the one side we produce journal articles, we write books, we get really epistemological. On the other side we want to just do stuff, right? Well, there are problems in both of those. We all know that these journals, I don't know how many of you have read this journal, many of you don't care about Africa, maybe you should, but it's also a little bit dry and boring, and we don't know how to use this stuff always. It doesn't translate into action. Well, the problem with Coney 12 is, what if that's not the right thing to do? And what if that's the wrong thing to do? What if what you're doing, in fact, just makes things worse? Okay? So that's a challenge. It's a challenge between these two worldviews, and I think it's something we need to take seriously. What I want to propose, this is, forgive my bad Danish pronunciation, but this is a guy who you should have read, and if you haven't, you probably will soon. His name is Bent Flugbjerg. I can't pronounce it very well, but Flugbjerg. And he's a planner, very big in Europe, fantastic social theorist, and also writes about methods. And this is a lovely book from 2001 written about methods. And it taps into this post-Enlightenment sensibility. Alistair MacIntyre proposes this notion of virtue ethics. and fluid purity is right on top of that, and Arendt was too. So these things all, as you see, come together, and I think are in a sense constitutive of the way we imagine ourselves. Well, what is the fluid purity model? Well, he says this. It's called frenetic social science. It's based on an old Greek word called phronesis, and I'm going to try to just say a very few words about what that might be. The fluid model is the principal task for frenetic research is to clarify values, okay, interests, and power relations as a basis for praxis. Okay, so values, interests, and power. And it's all organized around praxis. That is, what you're doing is praxis when you are exercising the virtue of phronesis. Okay, that's the way these things come together. The point of departure for such research could be summarized in 4 value rational questions. That is a nod to Max Weber, if you notice, which researchers ask and answer for specific problematics in their fields of interest. For instance, in urban policy and planning, where are we going? Who gains and who loses, and by which mechanisms of power? Is this development desirable? What, if anything, should we do about it? Now, I think those questions don't only apply to planning, but they also apply to conflict resolution. Where we know that we'd like to resolve conflicts, but we're also very sensitive now to issues of power. That's one of the hot topics. Kevin's written recently about this, and I think it's exactly right. We need to be thinking about power, because issues of power and its abuse touch on justice. And the problem with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in some ways is that issues of justice are often put on the side. What if those in power are just saying they are sorry, and they get out and they get to keep their estates? Well, that's maybe a problem. Is that what we should do about it, or something else? Against the next best alternative, and so on. Well, here's just a way of reformulating the intellectual virtues and that model I showed you, the sort of modified Bloom's taxonomy, taking 2 triangles and separating them out, the engineering and physics model. And you've got, and then these would be the 3 virtues, and you'd craft people up through this as instructors. So one is episteme, that is theory. Rich, we always talk about how do we produce theory? Well, we need to be producing theory, but not just for theory. The point is just not to be theorists. That's actually part of the problem. Techne is how. And you can think of it as a technology, is the root of the word technology as well. We need to have techniques and practices. We need to learn from practitioners who are doing things and not thinking about them theoretically. And there needs to be a space where people come together. But what we're ultimately trying to do, and you see I had this in dotted lines, is we're trying to produce value, rational behavior. We're trying to produce wisdom, practical wisdom, praxis. And that is by cultivating the virtue of phronesis. Now, I don't think you can actually script that. I think you can script theory. I think you can script techne, but I think it's very difficult to produce the reflective practitioner, the critical thinker. But what we try to do is produce settings in which those things tend to emerge in the individual life journey. And I think that's where we can organize our curricula. We've been talking to masters about this, and we're doing this in undergrad already. So here's a way of thinking about it. Here's how you might structure a curriculum around this. At the beginning, you do introduction, discovery. What are we doing? What is this thing like? What are our basic modes of evidence? How do we think? What makes it different from sociology, psychology, political science, international relations, psychiatry? We craft the field and introduce people to it. Theory then becomes a way of moving up into these 2 streams. Theory isn't about theorizing, but it's about how do you think in productive ways. And this is where it becomes interesting, and I think this is an important point to stress. Methods, methods of study, of investigating, become separate from techniques and practices. That is, you learn how to do techniques and practices, and you learn research methods. You learn them both well. You don't say, oh, they're just the same thing, because you know very well they're not the same thing. And if you've ever taken a statistics class, you know it's not like doing a group exercise. I mean, they're both crucial, but they're very different. And what we do in those classes, if you look at them, is very different. All the other classes that we really care about, in a sense, become moving toward that situated ethical knowledge, that situated contextual knowledge, specializations of various kinds. Much of what we end up teaching you, the students, talking about to one another, are our own theoretical orientations. But how does it culminate and scaffold up towards something else? This is an issue that I think we need to be thinking about. And where are we headed? What are we trying to do? We're trying to produce, in many cases, a master's thesis or a dissertation. And that's an epistemological project. That's about knowledge. It's about something that stands outside. It has to inform our techniques and practices, but in some ways they're separate. What we don't do, and we do this a little bit at the undergrad, but we don't do it at the other levels as much explicitly, is a field project. Now, we have field experience is essential. That is, you've got to get out there and do stuff. But is the dissertation, is the PhD level really about a cultivating technique to that level? Should you have to say, unless someone says, oh, so you're a conflict resolver, which conflicts have you resolved? You know, is that, should all our PhDs be able to say, oh, this one, that one, and the other? Or is it instead the idea that we're really in the article and book production, and we also are really interested in our relationships with those in the field? So this is a question. But what I think we can all agree on is that we're interested in phronesis. That is, we're interested in the intellectual virtue. Let's not, phronesis is distracting. Why are these Greek words so essential? They're not. But what it does is it helps you keep your mind on the idea that how power works in the world, what are your values, how can you draw upon general models, stuff that we know is sort of true. I mean, that word's a bad word almost now, but how do you draw on these general models about what we know and then put them into practice and learn how they're wrong and where they're right and so on? That's what we're trying to cultivate in ourselves and in our students and in the power elite. And I think that that is praxis, and it requires our focus on a particular intellectual virtue, which is not one that we explicitly entertain. Thank you.